Hello, and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 237. And with today's episode, I will be diving back into the realms of the Swedish band 220 Volt, this time with their second album titled Power Games, originally released in February of 1984 via CBS. And since this album is going to be reaching its 40th anniversary, again 40 years, then that means it is time to celebrate. So with all that said, let's begin. After releasing their self-titled debut in 1983, which did fairly well for the band, towards the later months of 1983, they would head back to Stockholm recording studios to record their follow-up. Thomas Witt would return as the producer, and as well Thomas Lundqvist, back as the engineer/mixer, as well as a guy named Lasse Mertner, who would serve as a secondary engineer. With this team, they would record 8 brand new songs. By the turn of 1984, this brand new album would be titled Power Games and would be released this time through CBS in February of 1984. So, featuring 8 tracks, clocking at the length of 36 minutes and 19 seconds. These 8 tracks are, of course, kicking off with Firefall, Airborne Fighter, Over the Top, Night Without End, Child or Beast, Mistreated Eyes, Don't Go, and then finally ending with Carry On. So there you go, folks. There's your 8 tracks. Now, while I've come to fully appreciate here their self-titled 1983 debut album, but when I first tried wrapping my head around the debut album here, was just merely based off of how much I liked Power Games, which in all honesty was a much more fully realized effort with a lot more hooks in comparison to the debut. But since with last November, when I finally had my moment to, well, do my episode on the debut full-length album, I've now finally come full circle here now with Power Games. So, let's start this. Now, while this album's sound is more bigger sounding, with a thunderous drum snare and a guitar tone that is as sharp as razor wire, they delivered an album that is not only more focused, but is more leaner in execution. There are still the same ingredients that were used on their debut, like the majestic, grandiose songwriting, but it's a little more simplified here, giving it a much more straightforward approach. For examples, just take one listen to tracks like Airborne Fighter, Night Without End, which is purely epic in its approach, and of course, the rather heavy as a ton of bricks of A Child or Beast. All these are about taking the elements that were used to create the debut, but much sharper here. Then there are tracks like Over the Top and Carry On. These two sort of feel like leftovers from the debut, because while the aforementioned 4 songs are expanding on the creative ideas of the debut, these 2 particular songs, I feel, are just mere extensions of the writing on the debut. Maybe more thought out, but wouldn't feel too out of place, especially for the case of Carry On, which is a guitar-driven power ballad that ends the album. It's sorta in the same capacity as a Night Wind if it were played straight. Then of course, we have the lone fast-driven rocker Mistreated Eyes, which is sorta in the same vein as Child of the Night, but much tighter with the killer guitar tone, and with a lot more conviction. It's heavy, and It Takes No Prisoners. What a total banger this one is. Easily a highlight off of this album. Now, where I begin to see the differences between this album and the debut start with the very explosive yet catchy hard rocker that is Firefall and Don't Go. These two show off the growth of the band, beginning to play with more simpler, guitar-driven melodies that has a slight commercial appeal. With Firefall's case, this actually was the song that inspired me to check out 220 Volt in the first place. First hearing it on the Rocket Cotton Steel compilation record, albeit with a different, more accessible remix. Don't Go is a fairly upbeat rocker with its fair share of catchy melodies. All around, this album has plenty of melodies, catchy hooks, and riveting guitar riffs, with even showing the growth in Jockey Lundholm's vocals, sounding more excited, giving off a great performance which I felt elevated these songs and makes them much more memorable. So I find it quite amazing that within the span of several months in between the first album and this, that they improved as songwriters and as musicians, to which why I feel that Power Games was objectively a huge step into the right direction. Great album all around. With the elements that I explained on, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why this album is considered 220 Volt's most crowning achievement, their magnum opus, if you might say. But that doesn't quite mean that the album that follows this one, Mind Over Muscle, was considered a huge disappointment. That album is also considered a great album by many who are fans of 220 Volt. And that's an album I myself need to revisit. But in the meantime, with this album reaching its 40th anniversary, this should be a great time for anyone to either pull this album out or, like I'm going to state, maybe give this one a listen if you're not quite familiar with this album. And again, if you want to see my episode on their debut album, I'll obviously do my best to leave you a link to that video so you can check that one out as well. But again, if you're just not quite familiar with 220 Volt, this is definitely an album you definitely should start off with. So since then, just definitely check out 220 Volt and their first two albums, and again, possibly Mind Over Muscle. But with that, if you are familiar with the band and the albums in general, and especially this one that I've been obviously showcasing today, if you have any thoughts, whether they are either positive or negative, you can all leave them down in the comments section below. So with that, this is Harry Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.